Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve, although we're not exactly doing Bible Basics for the season of Lent. Hello, John. Good to have you here tonight. So if you were here last week, you know that we had a snafu with our live stream. The browser I was using locked up on me while we were live streaming, and those of you who are watching at home had about a minute of black screen and silence. And if that happens again, continue watching. I will be back. I promise you. I just got to restart the browser. The way I'm doing this requires Chrome, and I guess Chrome isn't as stable as Safari. Oh, well. So good to have you here, John. If you're with us tonight, please say hi in the comments or the chat or whatever system it is you're using to watch us. And tonight we're going to be talking about Fear of the Other by Will Willimon, Chapter 3. Good evening, Charles. Let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer, shall we? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So, we had our class tonight, and we talked about Chapter 3, which is learning to fear like Christians. What does it mean to fear like a Christian? Well, it means to fear the right things and to not fear the wrong things, or more importantly, it means to fear God more than we fear our neighbors. And what does it mean to fear God? Are we supposed to be afraid of a vengeful God? No, not in that sense. And we talked about this a little bit last week. We should be afraid of the consequences of displeasing God, even if that consequence is only the guilty feeling we have from displeasing God. So that should inform all of our actions. And we've talked about how fear of the other is an evolutionary thing. Hello, Barry. Good to have you here tonight. How it's natural to fear things that are different from us, fear things that we don't know, fear things that we don't understand. But if we act on that fear, then we're in for all kinds of problems in the modern world. And what we need to do is to be in an open stance, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. So one of the things in the book, or actually in the book study guide, was the line from the song Amazing Grace. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Hello, Roseanne. Good to have you here tonight. So, talking about this tonight, how can grace teach your heart to fear and then yet relieve that same fear? And as an illustration, I told the class a story that I heard from my son, who had seen it on social media, about a guy was talking about how he and his girlfriend or wife or whatever used to play wrestle a lot, just having fun. And young people do crazy things. I guess I don't remember ever being young, but I guess young people play wrestle sometimes. And he would often let her win, just for the sake of being a good sport. Hello, Dave. And one night he came home from work and he had a really bad day. He was in a really rotten mood and didn't feel like play wrestling. And she sort of hopped on his back or whatever and was trying to get him to lighten up and come on and play with me. And he just wasn't in the mood. So he turned around and he sort of took her by the shoulders and said, "Stop." And in that very brief moment when he had her by the shoulders, he wasn't, he didn't hurt her by any stretch of the imagination. He just held her very firmly, and she realized, oh my gosh, I can't move at all. I had no idea he was that much stronger than me. And even though he didn't mean to hurt her or scare, he didn't hurt her. He didn't mean to scare her. She was terrified because it had never occurred to her before. First of all, that he was letting her win, and secondly, that he was that much stronger than she was. And she started acting weird for a couple of days. And he said, what's going on with you? And she said, well, it's just, I've realized for the first time that you could do whatever you wanted and I wouldn't be able to stop you. And he said, but you trust me to know that I would never hurt you, right? That I would never do anything. to you. And she did, but she sort of had to get her head around that, that this person is stronger than I am physically, but yet is safe to be around. And I'm not saying that the husband wife relationship is like a God person relationship. I'm not saying that at all. Maybe I never should have brought this metaphor up, but in the power differential there in that particular situation, maybe that good evening, Stella. Maybe that metaphor. Maybe at least that can be used as a metaphor, because I mean, the power of a differential between any two people is nothing like the power differential between any one of us and God. God could smite us in any given moment, but He's promised us that He's not going to do that. So um, we should be in awe of the power of God and in awe of the judgment of God. That's not the same thing. So that is a type of fear, but it's not the same thing as being afraid of God in the sense of being terrified of God. I don't remember if we talked about this in the video last week or not. We talked about it in class. When I was a kid, I was afraid of my parents. I was afraid of being punished by them. I was afraid in that I was afraid of being punished if I broke a rule. Now, I knew what the rules were. And if I broke the rules, I had a pretty good idea of what the consequences would be for breaking the rules. I knew that as long as I stayed within those rules, I had nothing to be afraid of at all. It was only if I stepped out of line. And I knew that if I did step out of line, whatever consequences would come my way, my parents would lay upon me because they loved me and they wanted me to learn a lesson and not do that thing again. And I knew that whether I agreed with them or disagreed with them, they weren't ever going to do anything that wasn't motivated by a desire for my best interest. They wanted the best for me. I never had to worry about them punishing me for no reason. I never had to worry about punishments being arbitrary. Now, I knew other people who were afraid of their parents in a very different way. Some of them felt that they didn't really know what the rules were because sometimes certain things had consequences. Other times, those same things didn't have consequences. And the only difference seemed to be the mood their parents were in that day. It's sort of, they just didn't know how their parents were going to react to anything. It seemed to be arbitrary. So the rules were not consistent. The consequences were not consistent. So they were afraid of their parents in a very different way because they were not sure that their parents were going to be motivated by their best interests. In fact, some people that I knew, particularly when I was very young in elementary school, they had parents that they were convinced were out to get them. They didn't think their parents did love them. They thought their parents hated them, and they were terrified of their parents. So that's a very different thing. We should never be terrified of God, but we should be afraid of God in the sense that we're afraid of what would happen if we consistently violated God's will. I hope I've made that clear. So then, knowing God then alleviates that fear because we know that God wants what is best for everyone. So this week, learning to fear like Christians, he talks about in the book how to be open to other people. And there's a pattern that he advocates in particular, and he didn't come up with this. I forget who he said did, but he quoted him in the book. When we encounter the other, somebody who's different from us, in a way that might raise flags for us because we're human and we fear the other, rather than reacting in fear, when we react in fear, the temptation is to adopt a closed stance. And this is going to be a metaphor, by the way. We're not literally talking about crossing our arms, although that certainly could be one way in which it manifests itself to us. But instead of crossing our arms and being in a defensive posture, oh, this person is different from us. I've never encountered a person like this before, whether it's, religion or whatever. Have an open stance. Let's get to know this person. Let's find out how we're the same and how we're different. And we're not going to minimize differences, and we're not going to pretend that everybody's all the same, that everybody's really the same deep down, because we're not all the same deep down, but we could be different in ways that enrich each other. So having an open stance and then waiting to see how the other person reacts. And maybe they will move toward us, maybe not. And then to be prepared to embrace the other for a moment and then to release, because that's how relationships are. You embrace, and then you hug, and then you let them go about their business. So that was a metaphor that was in the book, and we talked about that. One thing we talked about in class tonight that was not in the book was how nations can be affected by fear in their relationships with other nations. And I did that because Willimon in the book a couple of times has talked about military interventions, and this book is full of tensions. Okay, and that's a good thing, because we do hold things in tension. We are supposed to be, the book is clear that some fears are rational and some fears are irrational, and a Christian does not embrace irrational fear and then only reacts rationally to rational fear. So those things are in tension. Something else that's in tension is the threats between nations and how we should approach that. And I wish these tensions were named in the book, because I think they're easier to talk about when they're named. So he talks a couple of times about military intervention. He seems to take it for granted that military intervention is, or that military action, I should say, intervention is a particular word we'll get to in a minute, that military action is always a bad thing that we should be repenting of, and so forth and so on. And I understand that, because most Methodist leaders are pacifists. I'm not a pacifist. Most of our bishops are pacifists. Most of our academics are pacifists. Our people are very split over pacifism versus what is called just war theory, or the just war approach to violence. And our book of discipline has a doctrine in it that is it's a split statement. Okay, we are not officially either. What our position says is that we consider war to be a sin, but at the same time, many of us recognize that sometimes you must sin lest a greater sin prevail. And I'm paraphrasing, don't quote me on that, but something to that effect. Very often, whenever the United States goes to war with somebody, some Methodist leader is going to be up there and they're going to quote the first half of that statement, that war is a sin, which is true, but there's another half of that sentence that often doesn't get quoted. And so I wanted to talk about how Christians really do talk about these things, because it's all about how we reason through fears or fail to reason through fears. So pacifism, in a nutshell, is the belief that violence can quite simply never be used. That absolute pacifism is that violence can never be used. You can't use it to defend yourself. You cannot use it to defend somebody else. And the reason behind that, first of all, they would say Jesus said to turn the other cheek. Secondly, they would say that whenever you use violence, in the long run, you're causing more problems than you solve. And there is something to be said for that argument. My personal gripe with that argument is the Jesus part, because when Jesus said turn the other cheek, he was addressing a persecuted minority, Jewish Christians. Jews were a minority, Christians were a minority. Christians, of course, weren't Christians yet in Jesus's day. They were just Jews following Jesus. But living within a brutally repressive Roman Empire, and in that setting, when you're talking to a persecuted minority and you're saying you need to adopt a stance of nonviolence in relationship to each other and to your oppressors, that makes sense. Okay, I don't believe that Jesus envisioned an environment where Christians would be the ones wielding legitimate authority, wielding the power of violence themselves. Okay, so there's a distinction there, because it's one thing to say, if I'm part of a persecuted minority and I choose nonviolence, I am going to be the one who pays the price of that nonviolence, even if it's defending somebody else in that system isn't even really an option. Then we're just both going to get hurt, right? So in that setting, when you say we're not going to use violence, we're going to adopt nonviolence, the people who pay the price of that decision are the people who make that decision. When the person who is in authority adopts a position of nonviolence, they are not the ones who pay the price of that. The people they are choosing not to defend are the ones who are paying the price of that. So it's a very different moral question for me. Hello, Kayleen. Which is why some pacifists are what they would call conditional pacifists. So they would say that violence can be justified in self-defense or in the defense of another. Or they might go a little farther. They say there might even be situations in which instigating violence might be morally justifiable. But both of those positions, in conditional pacifism, both of those conditions would rely on an ethical argument to justify the use of violence. And that's where we get to just war theory. And fear is an important factor in this, as we'll circle back to at the end. Okay, so in just war theory, and this theory has been around for a long time. The Roman Catholics invented it, and it's now a basic part of international diplomacy and all kinds of philosophy. Going to war, using violence can be justified if 4 tests are met. 1, only legitimate authorities can engage in war. So if you're not the police, if you're not the nation's government, you shouldn't be using violence. Okay, you have to be a recognized public authority to use violence. The second is that, and for civilians, now the law allows, in practical terms, the law allows caveats for that, because in certain situations, private citizens are empowered by the government to act. But I don't want to get that complicated tonight. All right, so must be a recognized public authority. Second condition is that there must be a reasonable probability of success. So if you're a nation trying to decide whether or not you're going to use violence against another nation, even if you're the one being attacked, you have to ask yourself, do we have the ability to win this? Because if it is hopeless and you cannot win, the ethical thing to do is surrender. It is unethical to fight back if you know that it's impossible. The third condition has to be that it has to be a means of last resort. You've already tried every other way to end this situation without violence, and none of them have worked. You can't go straight to violence. It has to be the last option on the table. And the last one is that it has to be a just cause, which means an immediate threat to the well-being of people who are under threat. So that rules out if you've lost territory under just war theory, you cannot use violence to regain it unless somebody there is in danger. Okay. If they're perfectly safe on the other side of the line, you've lost the territory and the other side has it now, but the people that are there are safe, you cannot justify using violence to get it back. If they stole some of your stuff, but nobody's in danger and no additional property is in danger, you cannot use violence to reclaim it. Okay, you have to use diplomacy to attempt to reclaim it. So it has to be to protect life against an immediate threat. Those are the 4 conditions that have to be met. Now, in modern just war theory, there's also all kinds of rules about once you do engage in violence, there are ethical considerations that have to be made once you're in the heat of battle. And we're not going to go into all of that tonight. But the point is, fear can interfere with the judgment process when you're deciding whether or not there's a reasonable probability of success. Fear can sway you one way or the other on that. it can prevent you from acting rationally. When you're asking the question, is this our last resort? Sometimes when people are afraid, they think that they've tried things that they haven't really tried, or they didn't give those things their best effort. And whether or not war is a just cause, whether the war is being fought for a just purpose, that clearly can be swayed by whether you're angry or fearful or both. Now, in the book, he mentions Iraq a couple of times, and so looking at the world around us today, there are two major interventions that are going on. So, if you're a conditional pacifist or if you're a just war advocate, that means you believe that you can defend yourself, but doesn't mean that you can initiate violence under certain conditions. Okay, so Russia has invaded Ukraine. Now, if Ukraine is going to fight back, first they have to ask the question, can we win this? Or are we just going to get a lot of our own people killed, just going to get a lot of the Russians killed, only to end up losing everything anyway? If that's the question that they have to ask, and they made the decision that with the help of allies, they could prevail. Okay, now an interventionist would say that a third party perhaps should intervene actually in Russia for the purpose of regime change, just like we did in Iraq. Now, Iraq is a very difficult question. Okay, Iraq, because in Iraq, that was an intervention. Nobody was in the question. We went into a country that we were not currently being attacked by. So the question that had to be answered on a just war theory was, is there an immediate threat posed by this nation that somebody is about to get hurt? And at the time we said yes, there was. Then we found out that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Okay, so this is where fear comes into play, and where the pacifism argument comes into play. Okay, so let's look at Gaza. Okay, Israel was attacked by Hamas. Very few philosophers would say that Israel did not have a right to defend itself. The question is, did it have the right to intervene by invading Gaza? And here is the moral argument there. And once again, fear can intervene in this process. Interventionists would say that if we only use force defensively, that's when we get bogged down in these forever wars. Okay, they would say that in other words, they would say that if Ukraine is only going to act defensively, and if we're only going to act defensively toward Russia, Russia's just going to keep invading Ukraine until Russia has no more people left to keep invading Ukraine. Hamas is going to keep launching attacks at Israel for as long as Iran keeps supplying the materials to them to do that. So they would say that purely defensive action gets you into a low scale forever war, and it's low scale for us from a distance, but for the people who are living there, that's all they know for their lives is that war. So interventionists would say that there is never a reasonable expectation of an end of the conflict unless your goal is regime change. So it's sort of an all or nothing approach. They're going to say that the pacifists are right in that if we just act defensively, in the long run, we're just going to cause more problems in the future. The only solution is to go all the way the other way and to press for a regime change, which is a bigger intervention and more violence, but it has a definitive end, because once the regime is changed, then you can move forward into a new reality, if in fact you do that. So in World War II, that's the question. In World War II, did we do that? Okay, so in World War II, we thought we ended the Nazi threat, right? We had regime change in Germany. What we didn't account for was that the Nazis invented these anti-Semitic forgeries called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which they then distributed to Muslim extremists, which formed the Muslim Brotherhood, who think that document is real. And so the current anti-Semitism in extreme Islam is the product of World War II. We didn't stamp out anti-Semitism. It just was handed off to a different group. Likewise, World War II ended up in the division of Europe, which sort of put us into the position with Russia today that we're dealing with in Ukraine. So the question is, all right, so what is the right way to use violence, if at all? Now, I'm not a pacifist. I think we did the right thing by stepping into Europe during World War II. But we do have to understand that there is always going to be another shoe that drops down the road. To me, it's a much bigger question. To me, the low-scale, never-ending wars are a much bigger ethical question than the large-scale interventions. Okay, so large-scale intervention, World War II, it was either right or it was wrong. I say it was right. Large-scale intervention in Iraq, was it wrong or was it right? Will we know in our lifetimes, or will the next group have to come back and say, it seems like Willimon has definitely decided that it was wrong to do that? Hello, Mandy. So when you're terrified of another nation or another religious group or another ethnic group, and that corresponds to the security question, you could very easily end up with the wrong answers about the steps to deciding whether or not violence is justified. So that I thought that we needed a more in-depth discussion about fear and its relationship with violence, because it's not just the case that, oh, we were afraid of this group, so we went to war with them. Oh, we were afraid of this group, so we went to war with them. We had a discussion. We had a heated ethical discussion. Did fear and anger cloud that discussion? Oh, yeah, you bet they did. But we did have that discussion. That's a discussion that always needs to happen. That's my frustration, is the pacifists don't want to have the discussion. Just, nope, violence is wrong. End of story. Well, yeah, it's wrong, but that's not the end of the story. Watching 6 million Jews being exterminated is wrong too. So, and by the way, there's another approach. There's pacifism, there's just war theory, which limits pacifism. Just war theory is supposed to put limits on pacifism and on warfare. There's a third option that has no limits at all, and that's called militarism. And all modern nations, I would argue, were at one point or another militaristic, in that they believed that the threat of military intervention should be the primary tool of dealing with weaker nations. All of the modern nations went through an imperialistic, all of the current superpowers, I should say, went through an imperialist, well, you could argue that China did, and they were on the receiving end. Japan did, United States did, European powers did a massive imperialistic activity around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Major world empires were built, and military intervention was the primary tool of doing that. The threat of military force was the primary tool of doing that. And in cultures where military intervention is normalized as being something that doesn't need to be checked, doesn't need to be held back, it's just an unqualified good, that's when you begin to glorify warfare or glorify military becomes a class of people in a different sense that it is in our country right now. Our military prides itself in being outside the political process. It prides itself in not being a tool of diplomacy, but being something that's very set apart from that. Other countries, it's not so much like that. Anyway, so that's militarism. That the military does everything. All right, so that's all of our talk about fear for this evening. Um, I looked at the news articles. I did not see any Methodist news or global church news that I wanted to talk about tonight. So we're not going to do any of that. I didn't receive any questions. If anybody has any, you've got like a minute and a half to put any questions or comments that you want to talk about in the comments. And or any prayer concerns. I'll wait another minute. And if not, we'll go ahead and close with the Serenity Prayer. Next week, read chapter 4. If you don't have a copy of the book, I still say it's worth getting a copy of the book. If you're not at Otterbein, but you've got access to Amplify Media, you can watch the videos. If you are at Otterbein, but you're not taking this class in person, and you want to watch those videos, let me know, and maybe we'll work out a way where you can watch it. It's basically Will Willimon being interviewed, and he's got some interesting things to say. And the minute has passed, and we're going to go ahead and close with a word of prayer. God, give me grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Well, folks, thanks for joining this evening, and I will see you folks in church or online. God bless.